Hello and welcome to another session of the Canton podcast. I'm your host, Tree. This third episode had been planned from the beginning as a third show, taking a deep dive into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, especially into the selection process as it relates to two Buccaneers greats, John Lynch and Ronde Barber. As luck or fate would have it, the week before the show, the Buccaneers held their announcement press conference to induct Ronde Barber into the Buccaneers Ring of Honor. This tremendous privilege was absolutely deserving, and it was great to see it finally come to fruition. During this press conference, I had the opportunity to relive some of the wonderful memories of Barber's amazing play on the field and to witness the joy in his eyes to finally see those accomplishments realized in a significant way. This was important to him.
Finally. 16 years seemed short compared to the 7 years I waited for this. Thank you all for being here. I give my love to my family here, my friends. At the end of the day, that's why I played. My love and thanks also to the Glazer family. I've been fortunate. 16 years in one place. In today's NFL, it's unheard of. And I've had a blessing, really, to be in one place for this long and become more than just an employee for them. You know, I think we all feel that way, or at least people in the building. But for me, it transcends that. We become close personal friends. How long have I waited for this? I've waited this for a long time. There's a great list of predecessors into this Ring of Honor. Leroy Selman, John McKay, Doug Williams, Jimmy Giles, and then the list of people that I was with Warren, Derek, John Lynch, both of my coaches that I have the utmost respect for, Tony Dungy, who drafted me, and then John Gruden, who took me to a Super Bowl. To be up there with those guys it's humbling. I mean, I'm not going to say that I'm entirely humble. I think Derek characterized me correctly. But this is something that I really wanted. It means a lot to me to be able to share a dais with those guys. Look up at the facade at the, I don't even know what side of the stadium I'm going to be on. Which side am I on? Am I right next to these guys? Be able to look up there in years from now and be like, that was one heck of a team. You know, kind of completes the circle of this defense. And there's plenty of other notable guys. Simeon Rice comes to mind. Dexter Jackson was a Super Bowl MVP. But to be immortalized with those guys, it's pretty awesome. And I think Brian said it best. This is important to me because it's the community. I love this community. I'm never going anywhere. Me and Claudia bought property in Virginia, and we talked about moving there. And it's like, why would we leave here? Everything that I gave here has been given back to me 1,000-fold. And I don't think I could ever leave that behind. So thank you.
Barber's not your likely story. He was a later round pick, the third round, the 65th pick overall to be exact. And so he had to work his way onto the most talented defense in the NFL at that time. He was smaller than the ideal size for outside defensive backs and comparatively didn't seem to have the dynamic speed that some expected from an outside cornerback. Yet, after a little bit of time to get his sea legs, it was clear that Barber not only belonged in the NFL, but he was destined to be a star. Before I go back, let's come forward first to this past week when Barber had his first real taste of recognition for his outstanding accomplishments. This was overdue, but none of the delays can be attributed to anything but human nature, the football world's present way of looking at the game, and the absence of an understanding of his true contributions, the real mark that Barber has made on this NFL game. That's the purpose of this video. That is what I want to explain. In competition for the NFL Hall of Fame, currently there are three Buccaneers greats: Simeon Rice, John Lynch, and Ronde Barber. I will focus this show on the two current frontrunners in early Hall of Fame voting, John Lynch and Ronde Barber, who have advanced forward in some form or another in the Hall of Fame selection process. The third, Simeon Rice, has some success but less traction towards success than Barber in moving up the ladder towards the hallowed halls of Canton. Rice's story is perhaps for another day. Today I want to talk about the two most likely Knicks Bucks candidates, how they should be viewed, and what those in a position to advance their cause could do about it. From a perception standpoint, John Lynch is currently in the lead in the Hall of Fame consideration, having been selected to advance to the final group of 15 players in the selection process 6 times. John Lynch was a rock on what was arguably one of the most dominant defenses of all times, the Buccaneers Tampa 2 of the late 1990s and early 2000s. When a defense is named after your team, you know it was special. And the Buccaneers defense was very special. Just look at these 2002 defensive stats. These stats were displayed during the Super Bowl 37 game, clearly demonstrating why this team was in the Super Bowl. They were playing in that game because of that team's defensive dominance, period. All they needed was an offense that was semi-competent to complement them. John Gruden was able to provide that in 2002. I mean, look, these are not typos. Quarterbacks were miserable against the Bucs. Completion percentages of 50%, only 150 yards per game, just 10 touchdowns against 31 interceptions, and an average QB rating of 48.4. Each of these were the best in the NFL for the 2002 season. Then you go to the playoffs, and the team trotted on the field for the final games of the playoffs, the Super Bowl, with QB completion percentages of 53.3%, 199 yards per game, and no quarterback to that time had passed for a touchdown, while 4 times they had been picked off. Those 4 interceptions, up to 9 by the end of the Super Bowl game, with the opposing teams only scoring 12.3 points per game with just 2 touchdowns on those 9 interceptions. It was pure defensive dominance. This was a total team effort. No unit could be that good without a lot of very good players. One of those players for sure was John Lynch. John Lynch was the hard-hitting enforcer on the back end of plays at the deep part of the field, often in the free safety position, terrorizing defenders with his hard-hitting style that I'm sure caused nightmares for receivers entering his zone. Look at this.
You do feel like a warrior. That's the thing I love about the opportunity to play in this league. Come on!
go hit them like you never hit someone. Let's go.
Gotta have that little bit of a feeling of immortality that you're going after it. Okay.
The safety's job is literally in its name. He's the safety valve, the last line of defense against opposing teams making it into the end zone on a lot of plays. Walking onto the field for the championship game and having no QB to even throw a pass into the end zone at that point of the playoffs points directly to how well Lynch did his job on the back end. John Lynch was an absolutely essential part of the dominant 2002 Buccaneers defense, and he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame one day. But this is where the explanations come in. Notice that I said one day. There's a psychological aspect to the Hall of Fame selection process that needs a deeper look. Full disclosure, I've never stepped foot in Canton, and I've never been part of the Hall of Fame selection process. I'm approaching this purely from my understanding of the selection of the best in the military. As I see it, a selection process of the best shouldn't vary much because it involves two primary factors, more like questions that are universal. What are the selection criteria? And the less obvious, even unspoken question of, how do I feel about the nominee? Let's start with number one, the selection criteria. How does one select the best player out of a group of the best NFL players to ever play the game? Think about it. There are 32 teams. Each of them has a player or two at any given time who could be considered the best at their individual position for their individual team or in any individual year. Say from a conservative standpoint, each team has one player that's really special. That's 32 nominees for the Hall of Fame. But the board would only select 5 or 6 each year. How do you determine who is the best of those best? How do you whittle down a couple dozen worthy candidates down to just 5? It's a daunting task, and the voters have a tremendous responsibility to get it right. Entering the Pro Football Hall of Fame is to be immortalized for eternity. It is the highest honor bestowed upon the sport of professional football. And winning this prestigious honor can literally transform a player's life. It's serious business. I have a lot of experience with the award selection process. I've won a lot of awards myself while serving in the military, and I have sat on award selection boards, having had the daunting task of selecting award winners, the best of the best in our professions. We would approach the process with this in mind: the cream always rises to the top. Meaning the best are usually recognized as the best by the people around them. Therein lies the most important part of this argument for the selection process when we view the Bucs' current most likely candidates: John Lynch, and Ronde Barber. With that in mind, let's shift back to the Hall of Fame process. One person made a comment years ago that I see as particularly relevant in understanding how the Pro Football Hall of Fame selection process works. It boils down to one question. If you were asked to tell the story of the NFL, could you tell it without mentioning this particular player or person's accomplishments, their contribution to the game? I really understand this concept because there is a similar process used in the selection of the best in the military for the year or other awards. The only way to separate a person in a group of greats at any profession is to look at when and how many times that person was already recognized as the best by others, by his or her peers. Cream always rises to the top. There are a ton of great NFL players, those who stand head and shoulders over their peers. The players start by having extraordinary stats during their career, some just relative to his position in the case of non-skilled players such as offensive linemen. A Super Bowl ring is huge, but it's not a complete showstopper for entering the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Having multiple rings indicates sustained excellence as part of an outstanding team of professional athletes. Yet, when we consider what it takes to make the cut of the best, a selection to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, these critical things only earn the player the right to be in the conversation. These accolades alone will not often put a player over the top. As mentioned before, every team has a best of the best, and there are 32 teams. Each of these players, fans, and supporters will have strong feelings about why their player should be the one selected. How do you decide, as a Hall of Fame voter, which player made the biggest contribution to the game of football? The selection committee must move past what player X meant to the player's team or to his team's success and be able to clearly see that player's contributions to the sport of professional football. That, in my opinion, is key. The difference makers are the same for that selection committee as they were for our military selection boards. They are called discriminators, or things that differentiate the best from another best. From where I stand, I believe that the NFL's individual awards, such as League MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, Offensive Player of the Year, NFL Rushing Leader, most passing yards in a season or career, most passing yards of all times, most receptions of all time, most consecutive game starts for an offensive tackle, for instance. You get the picture. The problem with John Lynch is that he simply does not have those stats. A player can get around not having these types of accolades by perhaps winning multiple Super Bowls or having sustained excellence of 7, 8, 9 or more Pro Bowls and a few All-Pro awards spread out over a very long career, because those achievements are also rare and could be discriminators on a selection committee if compared to some classes without a bunch of super strong football resumes. There's a bit of luck involved, meaning there are the achievements of the players with whom that particular player will be compared for the selection year. But I've looked pretty hard, and from what I saw, John Lynch simply does not have the individual types of awards or accomplishments that were statistically above other great players. Although he does have a few Associated Press First Team All-Pro awards. But remember that the Associated Press First Team All-Pro is a recognition of the two best in the safety position. Concentrating on the arguments against John Lynch, let's just take a peek at some of the modern era safeties that have made the cut to get into the Hall of Fame. Because after all, that would be the first thing that I would do if I had to decide if player X was worth that level of recognition. I want to answer the question, how does Lynch stack up when compared to the legends who walked into the hall before him? Most of my information was extracted from Pro Football Reference, a source I trust to have accurate information. If something is not perfect here, it was my inability to transcribe data and not the PFR error. Paul Kearse, safety, played from 1964 to 1975, holds the all-time interception record in the NFL with 81. Ken Houston, 1967-1980, led NFL interceptions and reception returns in 1968 and 1971. He led non-offensive touchdowns in 1967 and 1971. Plus, he was honored with the Pro Football Hall of Fame first team All-1970s team selection. Kenny Easley, safety, 1981 to 1987, led the NFL in interceptions in 1984 with 10, led non-offensive touchdowns in 1984. Brian Dawkins, safety, 1996 to 2011. He led the NFL in fumble returns in 2001. Pro Football Hall of Fame's first team All-2000 team. Ed Reed, safety, 2002 to 2013. He led the NFL in interceptions in 2004, 2008, and 2010. He led in fumble return touchdowns in 2008. He led in interceptions, return yards in 2004, 2010, and all time, and earned a 2004 NFL AP Defensive Player of the Year. Those are the safeties who went in before John Lynch. In comparison, John Lynch has not won any singular award in his career, meaning an award that recognizes one person, not a group of people. The best individual achievement that I could find was he was the seventh best in forced fumbles in 2005. That may not be a complete list for him, but there were not many more, if there were any. When you compare those to the NFL safeties who were selected before him, the comparisons become stark. Could John Lynch slip in as a, say, senior inductee down the road? Perhaps so. In fact, in my opinion, I would be surprised if that's not his best bet to finally earn a gold jacket, unless he has a serious achievements as a contributor in his GM role. I think, and this is purely my opinion, that Ronde Barber is the next best chance for the Buccaneers organization to have another Hall of Fame inductee, perhaps even the only chance until a new crop of Buccaneers superstars emerge. Barber does not have an easy road, however, but his career achievements may merit inductions sooner rather than later. Barber's 14 touchdowns scored as a non-offensive player ranks fourth all-time in NFL history, but the significant consideration is that two of the players ahead of him are already inducted. That's Rod Woodson and Deion Sanders. And the other is not yet become eligible for Hall of Fame consideration, Devin Hester. In fumbles returned for touchdowns, Barber ranks, once again, fourth all-time, with only Jesse Toggle ahead of him, who is eligible for the Hall of Fame, who is not yet in the Hall. He shares fourth place with Derek Thomas and Link Lindman, who are both in the Hall of Fame. Barber has 28 sacks and 47 interceptions, a combined statistical distinction that makes him the only player in NFL history to have over 25 interceptions and take down the quarterback over 40 times, further separating him from his peers. Why is that significant? Why is that stat so special? Because sacks and interceptions are huge game changers, and players who rush the quarterback usually don't have many interceptions, and players who have a lot of interceptions usually don't get many sacks. Ronde affected the game in both categories like no other player in NFL history. In annual performance, Barber was statistically the best in the NFL in many categories. Ronde Barber led the league in interceptions in 2001 with 10, led in interceptions returned for touchdowns in 2006, and had the most fumbles returned for a touchdown in both 2000 and 2004. His 199 consecutive starts at cornerback is pure Iron Man status for that position, the most in NFL history, and he's the only defensive back since the 1970 merger to start each of his team's games for 12 consecutive seasons. Those are hefty discriminators. In my opinion, it would be impossible to write the complete story of the NFL and leave them out. I just don't know of any stat that John Lynch has that was singular in nature, such as best or only, or any area such as MVP, Player of the Year, League Leading, Most, or anything like that. I love the crucial contribution that John Lynch made for this team. He was the enforcer, a big-time Buck, the centerpiece of the historical Tampa 2 defense. I love this play as much as the Knicks fan, but then there's reality. The NFL Hall of Fame is for the best of the best players to ever play the game. John Lynch is uncontestably among the best Buccaneers to ever play the game. But so is Ronde Barber, and he's also one of the best NFL players to ever play the game. And he has the statistical achievements and accolades to prove it. And he may be the best, the only one left who realistically checks all the boxes needed to be selected as the best of the best NFL players of all time. That seems straightforward, right? No. That just covers the selection criteria. Remember that I talked about the psychological aspect of the Hall of Fame selection process? How do voters feel about the nominee? I know, what do I even mean feel about it, right? That's where I part ways with the Hall of Fame selection process. Not that I think that it's wrong, because I have no right to say if it's right or wrong. I simply don't like that normal human emotions are not better isolated from the process. You see, it's perfectly normal to like a particular player more than another. Let's face it, the players we like are much less likely to do something wrong in our eyes and much more likely to do something right. It's human nature. It's fandom. No fan base knows that better than the Bucs with Jameis Winston on the roster and the former defensive tackle Gerald McCoy, who was just cut from the roster. I cannot think of two players that are more polarizing to fans than those two. And most of it is purely based on how we feel about them. The same holds true across the board about every player in every fan base, although likely to a lesser degree in most cases. We like the players we like, and we don't like the players that we don't like. The player's brand, or popularity as it should be called, can be just as important as the player's performance. popular players, especially on popular teams, can do the same things or less and be loved more than players who statistically do more on lesser popular teams. This example in the 2019 top 100 players in the NFL selection, I think, illustrates my point perfectly. I'm not picking on one player here. I just happen to know about both these players without looking up their stats. So when I saw this, it immediately stood out to me. This is glaring and a prime example of what I am trying to explain. Branding makes up for a lot of defects. The absence of a great branding operation can seriously diminish the perception of how good a player actually is compared to others in the same position. Perception, unfortunately, often becomes reality in the minds of the public. Another example that we could point to that directly relates to the Hall of Fame was the current selection of Terrell Owens to the Hall, after what many believe was 2 years too late. I mean, look at these numbers from sportsh2h.com, compiled from Pro Football Reference, when they published the article Randy Moss versus Terrell Owens. How is one of these players a first ballot Hall of Famer and the other took 3 tries? Statistically, this can't be explained. Logically, this can't be explained unless you include the presumption that personal feelings, how someone felt about the players, was involved. Terrell Owens was hurt that he was not selected on his first or second opportunity to enter the Hall of Fame. And in protest, he decided that he didn't want to be a part of the official Pro Football Hall of Fame enshrinement ceremony. We are disappointed, but we respect Terrell's decision not to participate in enshrinement. Hall of Fame President and CEO David Baker said in a statement. According to Ray Wilson of CBSSports.com's piece, Hall of Fame voter, I wouldn't have voted for Terrell Owens if I knew he wasn't going to show up. Quote, Hall of Fame voters and former New York Daily News columnist Gary Myers said that he wouldn't have voted for Owens had he known that the mercurial wide receiver wasn't going to attend the enshrinement ceremony. Terrell Owens informed Hall of Fame that he's not attending ceremony, Myers wrote Thursday in a tweet that has since been deleted, according to Pro Football Talk. Unprecedented. Classy guy. If I knew he wouldn't show up, I would have voted for someone who would have, unquote. Shortly thereafter on the Dan Patrick Show, Myers expounded on the rationale behind his earlier stance. Myers also explained why Owens had been passed over during his earlier year eligibility.
You're a Hall of Fame voter.
Yes.
Do you guys really believe that Marvin Harrison is a better wide receiver than T.O.?
Well, I'll tell you, and I'll take you inside the room on this. And it was the second longest discussion.
We got about a minute here, by the way.
Okay. It's the second longest discussion we had in the room other than Eddie DeBartolo. The bottom line on T.O. is he was so disruptive. Now, with LT, you don't count the off-the-field stuff. That's a mandate from the Hall of Fame. It's only what you've done on the field. The argument that was made in the room, and I agreed with this, is what T.O. did in the locker room is part of evaluating.
That counts?
Because he
Why don't you just evaluate what's inside the white lines?
Because I think that the locker room is an extension of that. Because
but how do you really know what happened in the locker room?
But he tore teams apart.
But how do you really know that,
He's a
Gary?
Hall of Fame player that 5 teams couldn't wait to get rid of. So what does that tell you about how disruptive he was? I do think he will get into the Hall of Fame. I don't think there's any question about it. I don't know. I think what happened in the locker room and getting thrown off of 5 teams and being considered a cancer certainly prevented him from being a first ballot Hall of Famer.
Did most of the room agree?
Well, obviously, because he didn't make it past the final 10.
Yeah, you're right.
This is my issue here. This is a Hall of Fame voter clearly admitting that the voters treated one player's candidacy, LT, in reference to Lawrence Taylor, who had his own off-the-field issues, differently than another, Terrell Owens. Last I checked, the meaning of "it's only what is done on the field" cannot include the locker room, because I've never seen a locker room on a football field. In that interview, Ross Tucker challenged Myers, but Myers felt the way that he felt about T.O.'s actions in the locker room, but provided no facts to support his assertions. This is the human element of the selection process. There are lots of good players who have played on multiple teams, including first ballot Pro Football Hall of Famer Randy Moss, who played on 6 different teams. Under the tiniest level of scrutiny, when the way one person feels about another comes into the sphere of influence, they become glaringly obvious, as in this case, in my opinion. My issue with this exchange is that a voter is on record making decisions about a nominee, their rationale about their decision to vote for or against, and how that same voter admitted that they had a different consideration about another player. As I stated earlier, there's only one on the field, and I've never seen a locker room on a football field. Secondly, the presumptions are just that, unsubstantiated or supported when questioned, but admittedly used as part of the final selection process. Say what you like about T.O.'s stance on attending the Hall of Fame enshrinement ceremony. His reasons for concerns are well documented by the admitted actions of this voter. Even though I think that this was wrong, it's human nature. We tend to feel the way we feel about others based on our perceptions. The Hall of Fame needs to find a way to ensure that their rules and guidelines reflect this known limitation and guards against it. Speaking of Hall of Fame guidelines, that's my second problem. Why does Professional Football Hall of Fame just have 2 Hall of Famer players voting for who is the best amongst their ranks? This is the most ridiculous thing about the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Imagine the Academy Awards, also known as the Oscars, having all of its voters selected from film critics only, instead of the actual voting members, the 6,000 professional motion picture artists that make up the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. If you examine any professional awards presenting organization apart from sports, they're most likely exclusively selected by the people who actually have first-hand knowledge of the activity. The ability to write an interesting story about a game or team does not necessarily mean that writer understands the game the way, say, a former player, coach, or general manager would. I'm lost in the understanding of how this entrenched body of people have the power to decide what is outstanding play of professional athletes, especially when it comes to acknowledgments of the greatest achievements of a lifetime in that sport. I'm not advocating that sports writers should be eliminated, because they can provide valuable perspective. But in my opinion, former players, coaches, and general managers should have equal representation on the voting committee. The human element is ever present. Relationships between a player and the press are crucial in the narrative that members of the press turn out in their stories. There's no greater example of that than the strong support for some players and the lackluster support of others who have similar levels of success. As I mentioned earlier, I think that the example of the perception of the performance of Mike Evans versus Odell Beckham Jr. illustrates that point perfectly. The statistical facts simply did not align with the public perception. largely due to OBJ's portrayal in the media. The media loves Odell Beckham Jr., and he gets clicks. Mike Evans, not so many clicks. But his career has been arguably better than Odell Beckham Jr.'s at this point, and certainly has had less drama. If the Terrell Owens debacle did nothing else, it exposed the influence of relationships between the press and players, and how this power can be used, even abused. I think that the balance that players, coaches, and GMs would bring to the voting process would help to temper the effects of this very human tendency. The Pro Football Hall of Fame needs to ensure that they have the right mix of people who understand the social aspects of football, such as reporters, while ensuring that there is adequate representation in the room for people who understand the game intimately. That knowledge would ensure that voters recognize the contributions of players like Ronde Barber. There are two more perceptions that I want to discuss. The first one is the role of Ronde in what some consider the nickel corner position in a time when the nickel was not considered a starter in many defenses. Ronde Barber was a starter in the Buccaneers Tampa 2. His role revolutionized the nickel corner position. They literally pioneered the all-purpose defensive back, and Ronde Barber was model 001. Ronde did it all. He blitzed the quarterback. He blitzed the run as well. Ronde came hot on goal line plays, and he played the line of scrimmage disruptor in short yardage passing plays. Barber owned the interior of the field in the first 10 to 20 yards from the line of scrimmage. He was the ultimate thief. Ronde Barber would steal your lunch money. And if you played against him often enough as a quarterback, his play would make you worry about your job security. Players like Troy Polamalu, the Honey Badger Tyrann Mathieu, and Tampa's own Deion Buchanan, who had a position named after what he did, a position called the money backer, all made plays doing things that Ronde Barber showed were possible for defensive backs to do around the line of scrimmage. Ronde was one of the most productive playmakers in that scheme, and it would not have been even nearly as effective without him. The Tampa 2 is still played around the league, as well as part-time in some schemes, but there has never been another player to do what Ronde did in that scheme. Ronde Barber revolutionized the nickel corner position in a way that, in order for other teams to replicate, they needed two players, one a much larger player, mostly safeties, as well as their fastest cornerback, just to match the productivity of one man, one dynamic player, Ronde Barber. The final perception is that of a group of voters and an organization. These subtle messages that are sent through what a team does, says, and who they recognize. Let's face it, the Hall of Fame voters follow the lead of the player's team, even when there are no intentions to send any signals at all. When John Lynch was inducted into the Buccaneers Ring of Honor before Ronde Barber, it sent a clear message, though isolated in perception, that the Bucs valued the contributions of John Lynch over Ronde Barber. That was certainly not likely the message that the team intended to send, I'm sure. But that is a subtle message that the frailty of human emotion and perception could receive. There's nothing wrong with the order that the Bucs chose in their induction into the Ring of Honor. The team has the right to call it as it sees it, but the potential psychological effects are real. That playing field is somewhat level with Barber's induction into the Buccaneers Ring of Honor in 2019. But Hall of Fame voters need to know that the Bucs truly believe that Barber is a strong Hall of Fame candidate before they will shift their focus from Lynch to Barber for consideration. That's the final human emotion, the unspoken rule that we need to examine. The likelihood of a team getting 2 players into the Hall of Fame is, in one class, is remote at best. Those 2 players would have to be pretty damn special, say Brady and Gronk on the same ballot. I know that can't happen, but it was an obvious example for me because both are 100% surefire first ballot Hall of Famers, and they played on the same team. This just doesn't happen often, and I didn't take time to see if it ever did. Any team would be lucky to have 1 player inducted. The Bucs may have to make a hard choice here. Has the tide already turned away from John Lynch's selection? After making it to the final group of 15, there are 2 more hurdles to jump to make it to the final group of winners. When the voting begins, this group of 15 is whittled down to 10, the last group from which the final group of 5 is selected. Lynch made it to the final 10 several times, but in the last 2 years, 2017 and 2018, John Lynch failed to make it to the final group of 10, this final table for debate for who goes into the Hall. Have the voters realized the same things that I'm explaining here? If the selection process is working correctly, the way the Hall of Fame voters feel about a player should go out the window in this final round. It must be about what each player has done for the game of professional football, as indicated by the voting member earlier, and it must be about what the player has done on the field. The Bucs need to pick a horse, then get on that horse and ride it to the finish line. Then they can get on another horse and make a run to the finish line. Just as one jockey can only ride one horse at a time, so it stands for the Pro Football Hall of Fame, at least for these 2 most likely Bucs chances to be inducted. When we have an honest look at what the numbers say, how one of these 2 players has impacted the game of football, the race is not even close. Ronde Barber is a clear choice, head and shoulders above the achievements of John Lynch in pure statistical dominance. Ronde Barber has the professional achievements to win, to earn a gold jacket. If the Bucs want another gold jacket in its legacy, all it should take is for the Buccaneers PR department to make the not-so-subtle move to push the horse that can win.
When you put the helmet on Ronde Barber, he becomes one of those super action heroes. Something happened to him on game day. He's the most, I think, complete football player I ever coached. Pound for pound, the toughest guy I ever met. He was awesome. And he's going to put a red jacket on. He deserves it. He'll put on a gold jacket too, quick.
At the end of the day, this is about getting Buccaneers greats what they deserve. At this point, the team cannot decide which player is most deserving. The player's accomplishments already have decided which of the 2 most impacted the professional sport of football. Inside an impartial room of fair voting, stacked side by side, Ronde Barber clearly dominates the statistical achievements as he dominated between the white lines. This is why I conclude that Ronde Barber is the Buccaneers' best chance to have another player inducted as a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Go Bucs.